Oliver Grant was accustomed to winning. It was in his blood, woven into his identity as a man who never took no for an answer, especially when it came to the luxury of having his way in business and in life. Wealth had always shielded him, cocooning him from the ordinary obstacles that plagued other people. With influence came a certain power, one that Oliver wore like armor and wielded without hesitation. So, when his close friend, Ben, proposed a challenge on a particularly opulent evening in New York, it was almost impossible for Oliver to resist. After all, Ben had a knack for pushing Oliver's boundaries, keeping his ego sharp. But even Oliver could tell that this challenge was different. The night had been perfect in its predictability. The dimly lit ballroom of the venue had all the markings of exclusivity, from the meticulously curated decor to the champagne that flowed freely among the city's elite. Oliver took his seat at the corner of the room, his towering frame spilling over the armrests of a deep leather chair, comfortable in the knowledge that he had, once again, curated a flawless image for himself. He was dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that fit him snugly, though it emphasized his substantial size. Over the years, he had become accustomed to carrying his weight as a symbol of power and command, dismissing the whispers about his figure with the reminder that he could still outmaneuver any of his critics in business. Ben, on the other hand, was lighter in build and disposition, lean and sharp, a stark contrast to Oliver's imposing presence. He had been watching Oliver with a smirk all night, studying him in that way only a close friend could, as though he were waiting for the right moment to pounce. "Having fun?" Ben asked, his voice dripping with irony as he approached Oliver's table. Oliver raised an eyebrow, casually swirling his glass of bourbon. "It's a party, Ben. If you aren't having fun, you're doing it wrong." Ben's smirk grew, and he took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass before setting it down, eyeing Oliver carefully. "You know, I was just thinking, with all these women you surround yourself with, it's funny how none of them ever seem to stick around. Or, rather, how you never seem to stick with them." Oliver chuckled, unperturbed. "They know the deal. I don't waste my time or theirs. Why settle for a permanent arrangement when there are so many options?" "That's exactly my point," Ben said, leaning forward. "You're always looking for something that's easy, a sure win. But what if you had to go for something a little riskier?" Intrigued, Oliver leaned back, his dark eyes narrowing at the challenge implicit in Ben's tone. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ben grinned as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "I'm talking about something that doesn't fit your typical mold. You know, someone who wouldn't care about your bank balance or your charm, or lack thereof." Oliver raised his glass, mocking offense. "Charming is my middle name. Just ask anyone." Ben shook his head, undeterred. "No, not charm. Control. That's what you're really after, isn't it? Everything in your life revolves around control, and the women you date are no exception. They swoon. They flatter. They go along with whatever you want, and when they don't, you move on." "Nothing wrong with knowing what I want," Oliver replied, his voice cool. "It's better than wasting my time." "Sure, but what if I told you there was a woman who wouldn't give a damn about any of that?" Ben leaned forward, his grin widening. "A woman who would stand her ground, maybe even make you question your beloved sense of control." Oliver's curiosity flared. It was true. Most women he encountered were taken by his wealth, his name, the aura of dominance he carried with him. But the idea of someone who would look past it all, perhaps even challenge him, it was enticing in a way he hadn't expected. "Go on then," Oliver drawled, feigning indifference even as his interest piqued. "Who's this mythical woman you're talking about?" Ben gestured to the other side of the ballroom, where a woman stood by herself, seemingly unaffected by the glamour around her. She was dressed elegantly, but simply, her dark hair cascading over one shoulder, a quiet confidence radiating from her stance. She was stunning. There was no denying that, but it was clear she was different. She didn't flirt with the glances thrown her way, nor did she seek to impress. She simply existed, comfortable in her own skin and apparently oblivious to the scrutiny of the room. That, Ben said, a hint of amusement in his tone, is Lila Brooks. She's sharp, independent, and immune to the usual games you play. If you ask me, she might just be your biggest challenge yet. Oliver scoffed, though he couldn't tear his gaze away from her. She was different, yes, but he doubted she was immune to him. No one was. "And what's in it for me if I decide to take this challenge?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Ben's smile turned mischievous. $1 million, and the satisfaction of proving me wrong. Oliver chuckled, the challenge thrumming through him like a shot of adrenaline. $1 million was a petty sum for someone like him, but the thrill of the game was irresistible. His pride itched to accept, to show Ben and everyone else in the room that no one, not even this self-assured woman, could resist his influence. "Fine," Oliver replied, his voice low and resolute, "but I have one condition. This so-called challenge has to be a real commitment, a marriage. That should be enough to prove my point." Ben raised his glass, nodding in approval. "Agreed. But remember, it's not just about getting her to say yes. You have to stay married for at least 6 months." Oliver clinked his glass against Ben's, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced once more at Lila, who seemed blissfully unaware of the challenge that had just been placed upon her. To him, she was already just another goal, another conquest. He watched her intently, noting the subtle strength in her posture, the way her gaze remained unwavering as she scanned the room. She was beautiful, but more than that, she seemed self-assured, as if she knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone else to validate it. Oliver was drawn to her confidence, that cool, unbothered attitude that so many women lacked around him. He downed the rest of his bourbon and handed his glass to a passing server. It was time to make his move. As he approached her, Oliver took a moment to steady himself. He was aware of the judgmental glances that followed him, noting his size, the way he lumbered across the room with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. But he dismissed them easily, reminding himself that his wealth and influence always outweighed his appearance in the end. He was Oliver Grant, and he was about to win yet again. Lila looked up as he neared, her expression unreadable. She didn't react with the polite smile he had come to expect from strangers, nor did she seem impressed by his presence. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in her eyes as she waited for him to speak. "You must be Lila Brooks," he said, extending a hand in what he intended as a display of confidence. She regarded his hand briefly before accepting it, with a firm shake, her grip stronger than he anticipated. "And you must be Oliver Grant," she replied, her voice smooth and steady. Her calm demeanor threw him off for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I couldn't help but notice you from across the room," he said, injecting a hint of charm into his tone. "It's not every day you see someone who stands out like you do." Lila's lips curved into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Interesting, because I was just thinking the opposite. You blend in with the rest of them quite well." The jab caught him off guard, but Oliver was too seasoned to let it show. "A fair observation," he replied smoothly, brushing off the insult with ease. "But I think you'll find that I'm more than I seem." She tilted her head, regarding him with an intensity that felt unsettling. "That's what they all say." In that moment, Oliver knew that this was no ordinary woman. She was self-possessed, unflinching, and utterly uninterested in his wealth or status. The realization stirred something inside him, a hunger to win her over, not just because of the bet, but because she represented a challenge unlike any other. Over the next hour, they exchanged words that felt less like a conversation and more like a sparring match. Every attempt he made to impress her was met with a dry retort or a disinterested shrug, as if she was unimpressed by anything he could offer. She laughed at his stories without warmth, listened to his accomplishments with detached politeness, and maintained a steady, unaffected gaze that unnerved him. No one had ever resisted his charm in quite this way, and though it frustrated him, he couldn't deny that he was captivated. When he finally made his intentions clear, an invitation to meet again, to get to know each other better, she regarded him with a quiet, almost pitying look. Mr. Grant, she said, her tone polite but firm, I'm not interested in being another trophy on your shelf. If you are looking for someone to stroke your ego, look elsewhere. Her words, though spoken softly, hit him harder than he cared to admit. In that moment, he realized that this would be no simple conquest, but that only made him more determined. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze. Perhaps you should give me a chance to prove you wrong, he said, his voice low. She paused, studying him intently, as though trying to see past the facade he wore so well. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. One chance, Mr. Grant, she replied, her tone cool, but don't expect me to be impressed. As she turned and walked away, Oliver watched her, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Oliver found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Lila Brooks. He hadn't expected her to linger in his mind so long after their first meeting, yet her image seemed to follow him like a shadow, refusing to fade. There was something about her that defied the usual logic he applied to people, especially women. Most of them were predictably drawn to his wealth, to the allure of being with someone as influential as he was. But Lila had remained unmoved, treating him with an indifference that bordered on disdain. It was both frustrating and thrilling, a sensation Oliver hadn't felt in years. In the quiet of his penthouse, Oliver prepared for their next meeting with a kind of meticulousness that surprised him. He ordered a new suit, one tailored specifically for the occasion, with the finest fabric money could buy. He hadn't put this much thought into a date in years, if ever. Everything was carefully chosen, right down to the cufflinks he would wear, and the cologne he would apply, subtle but expensive, understated yet unmistakably exclusive. It was ridiculous, he told himself, the way he was fretting over this encounter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had something to prove. This wasn't just about the bet anymore, it was personal. When the evening finally arrived, Oliver found himself feeling an unfamiliar mix of anticipation and nervousness. He had arranged for them to meet at an exclusive restaurant downtown, a place known for its Michelin-starred chef and a waiting list that stretched months into the future. For him, securing a table was as simple as making a phone call, but he was certain Lila would recognize the effort and expense behind the gesture. It was, in his mind, the perfect setting to impress her. He arrived early, settling into his seat and adjusting his suit jacket as he scanned the room, taking in the opulence of the place. The restaurant was dimly lit, each table draped in fine linen and set with sparkling crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The air was filled with the delicate scent of truffle and aged wine, a heady reminder of the exclusivity that surrounded them. He ordered a bottle of the finest Bordeaux on the menu, imagining how he would present it to Lila, the way he would pour her a glass and subtly display his knowledge of fine wines. Yes, tonight would be perfect. But when Lila arrived, she immediately shattered his expectations. She stepped into the restaurant with a quiet, understated grace, dressed in a simple black dress that hugged her figure without drawing unnecessary attention. Her hair was pulled back in a loose chignon, and she wore only a hint of makeup. She was beautiful, of course, but it was a beauty that spoke of confidence rather than opulence. She didn't need the glitter of jewelry or the allure of designer labels to make an impression. Her presence alone was enough. And as she walked toward him, Oliver felt his heart beat a little faster, a reaction he hadn't anticipated. "Obie," she sat down across from him, giving him a polite smile that lacked the warmth he was used to. Her gaze was calm and steady, her eyes revealing nothing as she surveyed the scene around her, taking in the lavish surroundings with what seemed like mild disinterest. For a moment, Oliver felt a pang of discomfort, realizing that the extravagance he'd arranged might not impress her in the way he'd hoped. "Good evening, Lila," he said smoothly, trying to regain his composure. "I'm glad you could make it." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Good evening, Oliver. Quite a place you chose." He allowed himself a small, proud smile. "Only the best, of course. I thought it would be fitting for our first dinner." Lila glanced around, her expression unreadable. It's lovely, but I'll be honest, I'm not usually one for places like this. The statement threw him off balance. He had assumed she would be awed or at the very least appreciative, but her tone was almost dismissive. He tried to mask his surprise, offering her a reassuring smile. Well, I thought you might enjoy experiencing something a little different. Besides, I figured you'd appreciate a night of fine dining. She raised an eyebrow, her eyes glinting with a trace of amusement. I appreciate good food, but I don't need all the bells and whistles. A good meal is a good meal, whether it's served on fine china or a simple plate. Her response was a subtle jab at the extravagance he'd prided himself on, and Oliver felt his frustration mount. But he was determined not to let her rattle him. Instead, he motioned for the waiter to pour them each a glass of the Bordeaux he'd ordered, determined to show her the finer side of the evening, whether she wanted it or not. As the wine filled her glass, Oliver launched into a practiced explanation of its origin, detailing the vineyard, the aging process, the notes of oak and blackberry that made it so unique. He'd delivered this monologue countless times before, and it usually impressed his dates, who would listen with wide-eyed admiration as he displayed his expertise. But Lila merely listened politely, her expression neutral, as if she were humoring him. Finally, when he finished, she took a small sip, nodding thoughtfully. It's nice, she said simply, offering no further comment. Oliver felt his pride take another hit. Nice was a word he associated with mediocrity, and he could tell she had no intention of giving him the reaction he wanted. She wasn't playing along, wasn't dazzled by the display of wealth or knowledge he'd carefully curated for her. It was as though every effort he made only served to highlight the vast difference between them, and for the first time, he felt unsure of his approach. Determined to steer the conversation in a more favorable direction, Oliver decided to ask about her background. So, Lila, tell me a bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? She gave him a small smile, but there was a hint of wariness in her eyes, as though she were deciding how much to reveal. I grew up in a small town, far from the world of Michelin stars and fine wine. My family was pretty ordinary, hard-working people, but nothing like this. Oliver nodded, intrigued. And yet, here you are, mingling with the New York elite. You must have made quite a journey to get to this point. She shrugged, her gaze drifting to her wineglass. I suppose you could say that, but I didn't come here to mingle with the elite, as you put it. I came here to work, to make a life for myself. He sensed a story hidden beneath her words, an unspoken history that hinted at resilience and determination. But he could tell that she wasn't the type to lay her life bare for someone she barely knew. The challenge of unraveling her story, of coaxing out her secrets, only heightened his interest. As they continued talking, the conversation became a delicate dance of probing questions and guarded answers. Oliver shared stories of his success, of the challenges he'd overcome to build his empire, hoping to impress her with tales of his ambition. But Lila listened with an air of detachment, offering only the occasional nod or comment, as though his accomplishments were of little consequence to her. The meal arrived, each course more elaborate than the last, and Oliver watched her closely as she sampled each dish. She ate with the same composed elegance she displayed in everything else, savoring each bite without fanfare or exaggerated praise. When dessert was served, a decadent chocolate torte that had been flown in from France, she smiled politely, but her lack of enthusiasm was palpable. Finally, unable to contain his frustration, Oliver set down his fork and looked at her intently. You don't seem particularly impressed by all of this, he remarked, his tone laced with curiosity and irritation. Lila met his gaze, unfazed. I'm here for dinner with you, not to be impressed by a fancy restaurant. If you thought all of this would somehow change my mind about you, I'm afraid you've miscalculated. The bluntness of her words struck him like a slap. No one had ever spoken to him like that, especially not a woman on a date. Yet, instead of feeling insulted, he felt a strange sense of admiration for her honesty. She wasn't here to flatter him or indulge his ego. She was simply here, unapologetically herself, unbowed by his wealth or reputation. Swallowing his pride, Oliver leaned back in his chair, allowing a rare, genuine smile to break through his usually guarded expression. "All right, then. No more games. Tell me, what would impress you, Warrens?" Lila tilted her head, studying him with a thoughtful gaze. Honesty, for starters. A little less arrogance wouldn't hurt either. Her answer took him aback, but he nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. He'd spent so long building a facade of confidence and control, of using his wealth as a shield, that he'd forgotten what it was like to be real, to let his guard down. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, but in Lila's presence, he felt compelled to try. They spent the rest of the evening in quiet conversation, discussing topics that strayed far from the usual realms of business and wealth. She talked about her passions, her dreams, and the small joys that filled her life. Oliver listened, absorbing her words with an attentiveness that surprised even him. He found himself laughing at her dry humor, marveling at her insights, and gradually lowering his defenses, letting her see glimpses of a side he rarely showed. By the time they left the restaurant, the city, lights casting a warm glow over the streets, Oliver felt a sense of exhilaration and confusion. He had expected this evening to be a simple exercise in charm and manipulation, a game he had played countless times before. But Lila had turned the game on its head, refusing to play by his rules and forcing him to confront the very qualities he had spent his life hiding. As they parted ways, she offered him a small smile, her eyes holding a spark of something he couldn't quite decipher. "Good night, Oliver. Thank you for dinner." He nodded, watching her disappear into the night, her silhouette fading into the darkness. For the first time in years, Oliver felt a sense of longing, a desire not just to win, but to understand. He knew he was stepping into uncharted territory, and that both thrilled and terrified him. He had always believed himself to be in control, the master of every situation. But as he stood there, alone on the street, he realized that, with Lila, control was an illusion, a facade that she saw through with unnerving clarity. As he returned to his penthouse, the quiet ticking of the clock filling the empty space around him, Oliver felt an unfamiliar ache settle in his chest. Lila Brooks was unlike anyone he had ever met, a woman who didn't just challenge him, but made him question the very foundation of his life. And though he didn't fully understand it, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he couldn't let her slip away. The game had only just begun, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Over the following days, Oliver's thoughts lingered on Lila with an intensity that caught him off guard. Her image occupied his mind at odd moments, during business meetings, in the quiet hours of the morning, even in his dreams. It was a strange, consuming obsession, one that both intrigued and unsettled him. He'd spent his life pursuing power, wealth, and control, yet here was a woman who couldn't be swayed by any of those things, a woman who made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. Determined to press forward, Oliver contacted Lila, suggesting another dinner, though he chose a more modest place this time, a quiet cafe with simple, hearty food. It was far from the elite establishments he frequented, but he was learning that Lila didn't care about five-star dining or exclusive reservations. He arrived early, securing a table near the window, where they could overlook the city without being disturbed. For once he found himself nervous, glancing at his reflection in the glass, adjusting his jacket, tugging at the cuff of his shirt. He wanted to impress her, but he wasn't sure how. When Lila arrived, dressed in a soft blue blouse and jeans, she looked effortlessly beautiful, her hair loose around her shoulders. She gave him a small smile as she took her seat, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. "You chose a different place this time," she noted, looking around with quiet approval. "I didn't think you'd be comfortable somewhere like this." Oliver chuckled, trying to sound casual. "I thought it might be good to break the routine." She raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her eyes. You? Break a routine? I thought everything about you was carefully planned and controlled. Her words struck a nerve, though he hid it with a polite smile. Maybe you're right, he said, folding his hands on the table, but I figured I'd try something new. For you. She didn't respond right away, but her expression softened, her gaze steady as she watched him. Oliver felt the weight of her scrutiny, that sharp, assessing look she always wore when she was around him, as though she could see beyond the carefully constructed image he presented. It was unnerving and thrilling, and for a moment he felt a strange urge to be honest with her, to strip away the pretense and let her see him as he was. But the habit of hiding behind his wealth and power was deeply ingrained, and he quickly shoved the thought aside, focusing instead on the menu in front of him. They ordered simple dishes: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a side of vegetables. Lila selected a glass of red wine, while Oliver opted for water, a choice that earned him a curious look from her. "No wine tonight?" she asked, her tone light but probing. He shrugged. "I thought I'd try something different," he replied, trying to keep his response vague. In truth, he wanted to keep a clear head around her, to stay sharp and alert, aware of every word and gesture. Something about Lila made him feel exposed, vulnerable, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down, even if he didn't understand why he felt this way around her. They fell into an easy rhythm as the evening went on, their conversation weaving between topics as naturally as a river winding through the landscape. Oliver found himself laughing at her dry humor, captivated by her insights and observations. She had a way of seeing the world that was both practical and profound, a combination he rarely encountered in the people around him. He was used to superficial chatter, conversations that revolved around wealth, status, and ambition. But with Lila, the dialogue was different. She spoke about real things, about life and people, and the small joys that gave meaning to her days. It was refreshing, disarming, and for the first time in a long time, Oliver felt truly engaged. As they finished their meal, Lila set down her fork and looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Oliver, I have to ask you something." He swallowed, his mind racing with the possibilities. He'd learned that Lila wasn't one for small talk, that when she wanted to ask a question, it was usually something that mattered to her. "Go ahead," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Why are you doing this? Why are you pursuing me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Oliver felt a flicker of panic, but he forced himself to meet her gaze, determined not to shy away from the truth. He'd spent so much of his life hiding behind his wealth, manipulating situations to his advantage, but something about Lila demanded honesty. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because you're different," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "You're not like anyone I've ever met. You challenge me, and I—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I want to get to know you, to understand you." She watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I'm not a puzzle for you to solve, Oliver." "I know that," he replied quickly, feeling a pang of frustration. "It's not about solving you. It's something else. I don't know how to explain it." "No." Lila looked down, tracing a pattern on the table with her fingertip. "You live in a different world, Oliver, a world of money, power, and influence. I'm not interested in any of those things. I have my own life, my own goals. I'm not going to be someone you can mold to fit your world." Her words stung, but Oliver forced himself to nod. "I'm not asking you to change. I just want a chance to show you that there's more to me than what you see." She looked up, her gaze piercing. "And what exactly do you want to show me?" The question caught him off guard, and he realized he didn't have an answer. He'd never considered what he actually wanted to show her, what he hoped to gain from this pursuit. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, an uncertainty that gnawed at his carefully constructed confidence. I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a rare admission, one he hadn't made in years. But Lila's gaze softened, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Maybe that's a start," she said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the city lights casting a warm glow over the cafe as the sounds of distant laughter and music drifted in from outside. Oliver felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet contentment that he hadn't experienced in years. For once, he wasn't performing, wasn't trying to impress or manipulate. He was simply there in the moment, and it was enough. As the evening drew to a close, Lila glanced at her watch, her expression thoughtful. "I should get going. I have an early meeting tomorrow." Oliver felt a pang of disappointment, but he nodded, rising to his feet as she gathered her things. He escorted her to the door, hesitating for a moment as they stood outside in the cool night air. There was a warmth between them, a quiet connection that lingered in the silence, and for a moment he felt an urge to reach out, to hold her hand, to do something that would break the barrier between them. But he held back, sensing that any move on his part might shatter the fragile trust they were beginning to build. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice soft. He smiled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Thank you for coming." She hesitated, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. "You know, Oliver, you don't have to keep up this charade. I'm not here for your money or your reputation. If you want to be around me, you'll need to be real." The word struck him like a challenge, a demand he wasn't sure he could meet. He had spent his life hiding behind his wealth and power, using them as shields to protect himself from vulnerability. But Lila was asking for something different, something raw and unguarded, and he wasn't sure if he could give it to her. "I'll try," he replied, his voice barely audible. She nodded, offering him a small, almost wistful smile. "Good night, Oliver." As she walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city, Oliver felt a strange emptiness settle in his chest. He wanted to follow her, to ask her to stay, to keep talking, but he knew that would only drive her further away. He was beginning to understand that with Lila, patience was key, that he couldn't force his way into her life. If he wanted her to let him in, he would have to earn it, piece by piece. In the days that followed, Oliver found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. His wealth and power, the things he had spent his life accumulating, suddenly felt hollow, meaningless in the face of Lila's quiet strength. She was a woman who had built her life from the ground up, who had faced challenges he could hardly imagine, and she didn't need him or his money to validate her existence. It was humbling, and for the first time, Oliver felt the weight of his own privilege, the realization that he had taken so much for granted. Determined to prove himself, he began to make small changes, adjustments to his life that would bring him closer to the kind of person he wanted to be. He started going to the gym, working on his health, shedding some of the weight he had carried as a badge of power. He reached out to old friends, people he had neglected in his pursuit of success, reconnecting with them on a level he hadn't thought possible. He even began volunteering at a local shelter, offering his time and resources to those less fortunate, hoping that these actions would bring him closer to the person Lila saw hidden beneath his carefully constructed facade. But it wasn't enough. Each time he saw Lila, he felt the weight of his own inadequacies, the realization that he was still far from the man she needed him to be. She continued to keep her distance, watching him with a wary gaze, as though waiting for him to slip, to reveal the true motives behind his actions. And yet, despite her skepticism, there was a warmth in her gaze, a quiet encouragement that spurred him forward, that made him believe he could change. One evening, as they sat together in a small park overlooking the city, Lila turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been different lately," she observed, her voice quiet. He looked at her, feeling a surge of hope. "I'm trying to be." She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I can see that." They sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, and for a moment Oliver felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that filled the emptiness in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever be enough for her, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He was there, beside her, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The quiet moments in the park with Lila marked a turning point for Oliver, though he didn't realize it at first. He left that evening with a strange lightness in his chest, a calm he hadn't felt in years. But as he settled back into his penthouse, the silence of his life swallowed him again, bringing with it an emptiness that had always haunted him but felt more suffocating now than ever. The penthouse was impeccable, every item meticulously chosen and placed, yet the space seemed cold and lifeless. Despite the opulence, the city view, and the luxury furnishings, the place felt hollow. For once, Oliver admitted to himself that perhaps he was too. In the days that followed, Oliver threw himself into work and self-improvement with an intensity that surprised even him. He continued his health regimen, attending the gym daily, choosing better food, and seeking a nutritionist's help to get in better shape. He had always viewed his appearance as irrelevant, believing his wealth and power more than made up for it. But now, he wanted to make changes, not just to impress Lila, but because he wanted to become the best version of himself. The physical changes came slowly, but the discipline required to get there felt like a grounding force, a sense of stability that his wealth couldn't provide. Every few days, he would meet Lila again, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for long walks through the city. She always chose modest, low-key places that were unfamiliar to him, places he had never thought to visit, but which had a certain charm he couldn't deny. The more time they spent together, the more he realized just how deeply he had misunderstood people like her, those who found joy in the simplicity of life rather than in opulence and indulgence. With Lila, there was no pretense, no calculated attempts to impress or gain approval. She was always herself, and the contrast between her authenticity and his own carefully constructed persona began to unsettle him. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, Lila stopped, leaning against the railing as she looked out over the water, her expression distant and contemplative. Oliver joined her, glancing at her profile in the fading light. There was a softness to her face, a quiet strength that drew him in, and for a moment he felt an urge to reach out, to hold her hand, to break the distance between them. But he held back, afraid of shattering the fragile trust they had built. "Do you ever wonder why you do it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver frowned, uncertain. "Why I do what?" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "Why you live the way you do, chasing success, power, wealth. Do you ever wonder what it's all for?" The question struck him like a blow, and he struggled to find an answer. He had spent his entire life pursuing wealth and influence, building an empire that defined his very identity. But in that moment, with her looking at him as though she could see straight through to his soul, he realized he had never truly considered the question. I'm not sure," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always thought it was just what people like me do. We succeed, we rise to the top, we build something bigger than ourselves." "But is it enough?" she pressed, her gaze unyielding. He looked away, his chest tightening. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like it is. Other times—" He trailed off, the words dying on his lips. Lila nodded, her expression softening. "Maybe it's time to figure that out, Oliver. Maybe it's time to ask yourself what really matters." The conversation left him shaken, and as he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, her words echoed in his mind. He had always thought of himself as a man who knew exactly what he wanted, who pursued his goals with single-minded determination. But now, for the first time, he felt adrift, uncertain of the path he was on. He wanted to be more than just a wealthy, powerful man. He wanted to be someone worthy of Lila's respect, of her admiration. He wanted to be someone she could look at with pride, not as a project or a conquest, but as an equal. Determined to make changes, Oliver began to pull back from his ruthless business practices, reevaluating the way he ran his company. He started looking for ways to give back, to use his wealth for something meaningful. He donated to charities, set up scholarships, and funded programs for underprivileged communities. Each gesture was small, a single drop in the vast ocean of his empire, but it was a beginning, a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. When he shared his plans with Lila, she listened quietly, her gaze thoughtful. She didn't praise him, didn't offer words of encouragement or approval, but he could see a glimmer of respect in her eyes, a subtle shift that told him he was on the right track. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going, to drive him forward. Their relationship deepened, though it was still marked by a cautious distance, an unspoken agreement that neither would rush the other. Oliver found himself wanting more, wanting to bridge the gap between them, but he knew that if he pushed too hard, he would only drive her away. So he waited, biding his time, letting her set the pace, and slowly, gradually, she began to let him in. One evening, as they sat together on a bench in Central Park, Lila turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Oliver, there's something I need to tell you." His heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What is it?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. Whatever it is we're building, it's not going to be easy. There are things about me, about my past, that you don't know, things that might change the way you see me." He frowned, confused. "Lila, I don't care about your past. Whatever it is, it doesn't change how I feel." She shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "It's not that simple, Oliver. You've spent your life surrounded by people who admire you, who look up to you because of your wealth and power. But with me, it's different." "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling a pang of unease. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "You destroyed something that mattered to me. Years ago, your company took over a small business, a family business. You probably don't even remember it, but it meant everything to us. My father ran that business, and when you bought it out, he lost everything." Oliver felt a chill run down his spine as her words sank in. He had taken over countless businesses, crushed countless competitors in his rise to the top, but he had never considered the personal toll, the lives left in the wake of his ambition. I didn't know," he stammered, feeling a surge of guilt and regret. "I know you didn't," she replied, her voice soft but firm, "and I don't blame you, but it's important for you to understand that the choices you've made, the empire you've built, it has real consequences. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet or dollars in a bank account. It's people, lives, families." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and he felt a hollow ache in his chest, a weight of guilt that he had never confronted before. He wanted to apologize, to make amends, but he knew that words were meaningless in the face of the pain he had caused. All he could do was listen, absorbing the weight of her story, the reality of his actions. In the days that followed, Oliver wrestled with a sense of guilt and self-doubt that he had never experienced before. He began to see his life, his choices, through a different lens, and the image that stared back at him was not one he was proud of. He had spent years building a kingdom on the backs of others, using his power to crush anything that stood in his way. But now, for the first time, he saw the cracks in his empire, the lives that had been shattered in his pursuit of success. Determined to make a change, Oliver began reaching out to the families and businesses he had wronged, offering reparations, apologies, and support. He knew it wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a start, a step toward redemption. And slowly, he began to feel a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning that went beyond wealth and power. Lila watched his efforts with a quiet intensity, her gaze both skeptical and hopeful. She didn't offer him forgiveness, didn't absolve him of his sins, but she saw his efforts acknowledged the sincerity of his remorse, and gradually she began to let him in, to open up in ways she hadn't before. Their relationship deepened, marked by moments of vulnerability, of shared pain and healing. Oliver found himself growing, changing, shedding the layers of arrogance and pride that had defined him for so long. With Lila's guidance, he learned to see the world differently, to value people for who they were rather than what they could offer him. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, truly connected to something bigger than himself. When he finally confessed his love for her, it was with a sincerity that surprised even him. He told her that he wanted to build a life with her, not out of a desire to win or conquer, but out of a genuine desire to be with her, to share in the life they had built together. And as Lila looked at him, her gaze softening, he knew that he had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had found love, redemption, and a chance to become the man he had always wanted to be. As she turned and walked away, Oliver watched her, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and something else, something he hadn't felt in years.